Hi there, and welcome to our event, Unlocking Communication in Geographically Distributed Workforces. My name is Greg Parks and I'm the Managing Director of Mumba. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. Shortly, I will introduce our guest speaker and panellists, but before doing so, I want to take a moment to set the scene for the event. So firstly, who is Mumba and why do we host events like these? Well, Mumba is an HR tech company and our whole reason for existing is to make work easier and life better. We work with large enterprise employers with geographically distributed workforces, employees who are typically not sitting in front of a desk all day. And our employee experience platform is a mobile-first app that brings all your HR and business systems together in a single user interface, coupled with a suite of communication and benefit tools that drive productivity, communication, and well-being. And at Mumba, we're passionate about themes that have the power to make the world a better place. By bringing the best and brightest together to share best practice in employee engagement strategies, we can make our organisations and the world around us a much better place. Today, we're releasing the third white paper in our 4-part digital and deskless series, which focuses on unlocking communication in geographically distributed workforces. The research paper was authored by Dr Fiona McKenzie. Fiona is a human geographer with a PhD on innovation. She's the founder of Orange Compass, which is a consultancy dedicated to supporting change makers on their journey to transform systems and build better futures. And she's also our guest speaker today. As part of this research piece, Fiona interviewed a number of senior executives in some of Australia's largest and most important organisations. And we're lucky enough to have a number of them sitting on our panel today, including Dr. Sandra Cheeseman, the Chief Operating Officer from C&K, Tracy Curo, Executive Director Communications and Engagement from Ambulance Victoria, Fiona Murphy, GM People and Culture from MyCar, Jodie McAloney, Director of People and Culture from Churches of Christ in Queensland, and Lucy Hartman, the National GM Payroll from ISS Facility Services. So thank you very much for being part of this event. We hope you enjoy it. Dr. Fiona McKenzie, welcome and thanks for being with us today. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us about the findings of your research paper, Unlocking Communication in Geographically Distributed Workforces?
Thanks, Greg. Welcome, everyone. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that my feet are placed on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to thank you for being here this morning. I know how easy it is to sign up to a webinar and then when it gets to it, you suddenly think, I'm quite busy. So really appreciate you making the time to be here and to be part of this conversation, and really encourage you to use the Q&A function as we go through to ask questions of the panelists. Now, I'm going to talk to you for hopefully less than 10 minutes. And as I said to Greg, he can't kick me under the table. So I'll try not to go too much over that, but I'll be good. But really, this focus on distributed workforces, I want to explain what that is first and why it's of interest. So essentially, a distributed workforce is one that's geographically dispersed. So that could be over the nation, over a state, over internationally. But essentially what it means is that we've got dispersed teams, and often, not always, but often, managers and their direct reports are not always in the same location, or not very often, or over for extended periods of time. What's really interesting is this is obviously an increasing challenge, probably more so than any of us anticipated when we started this work. And for me, I've done quite a bit of research around the future of work, but it actually has really been around what we might call white collar roles. And that's been really interesting in the context of COVID as well, where we're hearing a lot about things like the sudden shift to working from home, but that actually is only relevant for about 30% of the Australian workforce. 70% of the workforce doesn't have that option because of the nature of their role. You'll also notice that I've used some simplified terms, and they're not perfect terms. I apologise for their gross simplicity, but the white, pink and blue collar terms. So white collar typically relates to sort of professional office and management roles. Pink collar is pretty much care roles, hospitality and also retail. And then blue collar typically relates to skilled labour and trade and all sorts of manual roles as well. And I also want to acknowledge that while we're talking about the future of work and today, it's actually not a new trend. So many of the biggest industries, the biggest sectors in Australia are actually made up of distributed workforces: retail, transport, agriculture, mining, childcare, aged care, airplanes, you name it, most of them are distributed workforces. And in these cases, it's not a choice. It's not that someone gets to work from home or work flexibly. It's often, it's the nature of the role, whether they're on the road, on a site, between sites, inspecting sites, whatever it is. So my task in this work was to really look at what are some of the trends, and then what are some of the implications, particularly for distributed workforces. Productivity, communication and wellbeing have all been a focus throughout this work, but today the real focus is on communication. I'm just going to give you a really high-level overview of this, and I will show you one slide at the end just to capture the key points, but you'll also get more in the report. So the first batch of themes relate to, well, I've put them in the bucket of mindset shifts. So this is really about changing views around how communication happens. And one of the most interesting and the first things that became really apparent was this shift in the view of communications and connection as real work. And what that means here is that one of the biggest barriers to effective communications at work, particularly when you're on site, is not the lack of technology. 9 out of 10 Australians have a smartphone. It's actually the view that using that phone at work or talking to colleagues at work is wasteful or unproductive. This is particularly true for client-facing roles or carer roles, where obviously the client has priority, but there's also policies and other cultural norms that limit face-to-face interaction. So that's been one of the sort of emerging areas around this real challenging of the fact that it's not seen as real work, and that talking to employees, taking time out to do that is actually a really important, valid thing. And particularly in the context of COVID, that's really helped push that. And quite a few of these trends we'll see have been fueled by that COVID shift, including the importance of real-time immediate communications, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The next trend is around really this idea of a new kind of leadership. And this came up in quite a few conversations around a changing approach or understanding of the role of leadership, at the management role, and this idea that leading a distributed workforce, it's not about command and control or being in charge in a traditional sense. We can't necessarily have the same influence as we would if we're in an office. So this idea of skills around how to empower others regardless of position, how to connect, communicate and manage things like conflict from a distance or even virtually online. All of these things, meaning the manager also has to be able to come up with fit for purpose solutions to actually foster social connection and, most importantly, trust. So it's this real shift in thinking about what is the role of the leader. It's not just about allocating rosters or making sure people turn up to work. It's actually making sure they're connected at work. The next trend is around approaches to information flow. So this is quite an interesting one as well. So traditionally, we often take what we would call a cascade approach, where information is shared down through the organisation, through divisions, from senior management, and filtered down to different employees. The further you are from head office, the further the information and ideas have to travel. And this is very valid, particularly when you're just trying to broadcast news. But when you're trying to actually have communication that goes in different directions, there's some new approaches emerging, including what we'd call a networked approach. So a network doesn't have hierarchy, it's decentralised, it's reinforced by participation, and often is formed because of shared interest. So there's ways in which organisations are looking at what are the shared interests of our employees, how can we actually help them to make their own networks. Essentially what a network does is it reduces the distance between any part. So instead of having to travel all the way back up through the hierarchy and even down into another silo in the organisation, the idea is that the distance is the same between all parts, no matter where you are in the organisation, to reduce the barriers to communication and to make things much more direct and speedy. The next one, greater employee autonomy, is also really came clear through both the research, the literature, and through the conversations we've had around empowering employees. And this is linked to the network approach, but it's this idea of generating conditions where employees can drive their own engagement, rather than being dependent upon decisions driven by the executive team, or that the organisation having to somehow drive engagement themselves. And communications is playing an increasingly important role in creating these conditions. For example, in the way information is presented and how that happens, but also giving staff greater autonomy and thinking about the role of communication, rather than being the single source of all knowledge and truth, or needing to drip feed information at a certain time or rate. This is really this idea that employees can pursue and make sense of information at their own pace, and the role of communications is actually to help them navigate the information. to actually do that sense making and to understand and navigate it in their own way. Similarly, training and learning and development, it's often now about the opportunities are there, make them available, and employees can move their way through, again, at their own pace rather than being drip-fed different opportunities. So that's 4 big trends in the mind shift category. And again, I'm covering them really quickly, but communications is real work, a new kind of leadership, new approaches to information flow, and greater employee autonomy. And the second big area or bucket of work is around practice change, so the way communications is done. The first one I'm going to focus on here is this greater focus on or emphasis on cultivating trust as a critical practice. This is also linked to the leadership piece, but you know, trust has always been essential. It's part of good teams, but it's really difficult when there's limited opportunities for social interaction, face-to-face interaction. You know, it means the quality of communication becomes so much more important. And quality is influenced by things like the frequency, the type, the scope, the structure, and the openness of information exchange. Trust is not only generated by good communications, but it actually further enables it. So an example is team learning. Learning is more than a simple exchange of knowledge or best practice. It's actually a social process. And there's a lot of research saying that employees require psychological safety to engage in learning. So that means they're more likely to share knowledge with their colleagues or with others if they believe their working environment is secure and that their standing won't be threatened when knowledge is shared. So they're not going to, there's not going to be any ripple effect or negative consequences of that participation. The next one, real-time communications for rapid decision-making. This came up a lot, particularly because COVID-19, the pandemic, has brought to light this crucial role of being able to understand very quickly what is happening on the ground, make quick decisions, have informed decision-making. And what this has really meant is that the pathways for the exchange of timely information have suddenly become much more dual or multi-pathway. So whether it's a change of plans from head office or staff experiences on the ground, it's been a complex task though. So people have different ways and needs for accessing information. They often don't have their phone on them. They might be working on shifts at different times of day in different locations. So it's interesting to look at all the different strategies that have been employed during this time to actually enable this much faster two-way communication flow and rapid decision-making. So things like daily team huddles, decentralized decision-making approaches, implementing rapid feedback loops, network approaches, and even tailored technologies and Facebook channels. There's been all sorts of ways in which this is really being tackled. The next piece in this is about reinforcing worth, and this is a theme that has come through in the research around productivity as well, but it's really this idea that dignity at work comes from recognition and is really strongly linked to engagement. And placing greater recognition on the inherent worth and value of all roles, it's both an opportunity and a challenge during COVID. And communications can reinforce or detract from this sense of worth. So research has shown many workers, particularly blue-collar workers, believe they're not considered valuable by their organisation. And this is not always a reflection of the organisation, but comes from a sense that others in society might dismiss their competence. But during COVID, what's been really interesting is the public attitude and the public framing of essential workers has shifted. So a lot of people who previously felt invisible, whether it's cleaners, supermarket employees, carers, are suddenly getting acknowledged. Some of them are getting thanked in the street. There's been a real shift about what it means to be essential. And I think the challenge here is that it's really important in communications to frame messaging that doesn't inadvertently imply that competency and leadership only come from head office. The final one, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll just quickly get through this, but the final one is this, again, probably one of the really fascinating ones, is this idea of a more equal playing field. So what's been really interesting about this shift during COVID to not being face-to-face is that it's really revealed how uneven the playing field was before. So what that means is if you're in a regional office and you're dialing into a head office meeting, for example, and you're the one person at the back of the room on a telephone, it's really hard to participate. It's hard to be involved when everyone else is there physically. But what COVID has done is meant that regional distributed teams can actually be involved in conversations. Head office is on the phone or on Zoom or whatever as well. So that's been a really interesting consequence. It's actually noticeably increased engagement in these organisational discussions. And I think the implication of that is going forward is it may not always be, even when it's possible to happen, to go back to face-to-face, that may not always be the best choice. Trying to do hybrid meetings or have a mix of face-to-face, sometimes the choice might be, let's just keep it virtual to keep it fair. So really interesting outcome. And just linked to that as well, these individualized communications and a move away from cascade approaches, this idea of tailored communications, multi-channel communications, really thinking carefully about frequency and format. But the bottom line being there's no one size fits all. There are going to be different preferences, purposes. You know, there's a diversity of styles of communication across the organisation. So I think the key message in all of this is a multitude of strategies are needed. So I'm just going to just share this just as a little bit of a final summary to say these are the 8 areas that are covered in the 9 areas that are covered in the report. As I said, in these 2 big categories. And I guess that's all we have time from me today, but you're going to hear a lot more from our panelists. And I guess, as I said, the bottom line is that by shifting about how we think about and approach communications, we can actually really improve the ways we connect at work for more engaged, empowered and energised teams. And in light of the current pandemic, hopefully these insights are really useful and have relevance for workforces that have always been distributed, but those that are also newly facing this challenge. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand back to Greg and let us hear from this wonderful panel that we have.